All right. Thanks everybody for being here today. It's 2 minutes after 12 o'clock. So we're just going to go ahead and get started to be respectful of people's time today. So welcome. Good afternoon. Welcome to episode 5 of our 4R River educational webinar series. My name is Emily Floor, and I'm the executive director for St. Mary's Riverkeeper. The St. Mary's River watershed is home to many federally and protected species, including the red-cockaded woodpecker, gopher tortoise, indigo snake manatee, and the wood stork, which was recently proposed as being delisted by Fish and Wildlife Service. The mouth of the river is critical calving habitat for the endangered North Atlantic right whale, in which there are fewer than 350 left in the wild and fewer than 70 breeding females. Our river is home to 2 species of federally endangered fish, the short-nosed sturgeon and the Atlantic sturgeon. Sturgeon species are living fossils as they date back to the time of the dinosaurs, and they are anadromous and considered home stream spawners because they live in salt water but return to fresh river systems that they are born in. However, due to overfishing and habitat loss, the populations have declined and were listed as endangered in 2012. The St. Mary's River is designated critical habitat for both, meaning that the river has physical and biological features essential to the conservation of the species. Conservation objectives for the South Atlantic species is to increase survival of all life stages and facilitate adult reproduction and juvenile and subadult recruitment into adult population. Any activity that affects those features directly, like dredging, or indirectly, such as sedimentation or saltwater intrusion, would affect the sturgeon habitat. Also, groundwater pumping and industrial and developmental has impacted water quality through introduction of nutrients and other contaminants. Because we do not know where this endangered and small population within our watershed spawns, we must be sure that any major residential development or industrial project will not negatively impact the local population of the Atlantic sturgeon by reduction in water flow, resulting in saltwater intrusion and the potential of water quality issues. Today's webinar is an opportunity for everyone to learn about the sampling and research efforts of the sturgeon in the St. Mary's River from Dr. Adam Fox, an assistant professor who is leading the research for sturgeon in all Georgia's coastal rivers. But before we get to his presentation and your questions, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about St. Mary's Riverkeeper and the work we are doing to protect our St. Mary's River. Founded in 2016, St. Mary's Riverkeeper is an independent voice for the St. Mary's River, dedicated to improving water quality, ensuring the river thrives for future generations, promoting low-impact development, finding solutions for river-related issues in the watershed, and advocating against industrial threats. As a trusted voice for the St. Mary's River, we fulfill our mission through educational and outreach programs, water quality monitoring, and advocacy efforts. We also provide opportunities for people to experience and serve their river through boat rides, field trips, and river cleanups. Our top priorities at the moment are monitoring the health of our waterways through frequent water quality testing and raising awareness about the potential impacts the proposed mine may have on the health of our St. Mary's River. As a border river, the St. Mary's River watershed is comprised of 4 counties, 2 in Georgia and 2 in Florida, with roughly 160,000 residents who depend on the health of the river for tourism, recreation, and commercial fishing. Rising from the Okefenokee Swamp, the St. Mary's River flows 130 miles to the Atlantic Ocean at Cumberland Island National Seashore. The watershed is 1,600 square miles and is comprised of 40% wetlands. The shape of the St. Mary's River is defined by the natural break and trail ridge. The Okefenokee Swamp and the upper section of the St. Mary's runs along the western side of Trail Ridge. The river then turns eastward for about 15 miles as it makes its way through the only gap in Trail Ridge. Then the river heads north again for about 30 miles running on the eastern side of Trail Ridge before turning east at the Folkston Hilliard area to head out to the Atlantic Ocean at Cumberland Island National Seashore. In 2022, Georgia Department of Natural Resources declared 2 segments of the St. Mary's River safe for recreational use: Deep Creek to Boone Creek and Prospect Landing to Little St. Mary's. This upgrade means that EPD is committed to protecting these segments for recreation with higher levels of acceptable water quality. So some ways that y'all can engage with St. Mary's Riverkeeper. We are currently running our summer water quality campaign where we are focusing on specific sites for enterococci, which is a bacteria that thrives in salt water. We have a cleanup on Stokes Road on August 19th, where there are hundreds of tires being disposed of there. And then on October 21st is our biggest fundraiser of the year, our Low Country Boil. So I'm going to turn over to Dr. Fox, as that's what everybody is here to listen for. So Dr. Fox earned his BA in marine biology from Roger Williams University, his MS in coastal marine and wetland studies at Coastal Carolina University, and his PhD from University of Georgia. He has been a faculty member at the University of Georgia since 2018. Dr. Fox's research focuses mainly on life history, population dynamics, and ecology of marine and diadromous fish. Much of his recent work has focused on endangered Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon in Georgia and threatened Gulf sturgeon in the Apalachicola River in Florida. His research investigates movement, habitat use, recruitment, abundance, and survival of these imperiled species. Dr. Fox has also worked with coastal sharks, long-nosed gar, gap gar, Atlantic tripletail, bottlenose dolphins, and salt marsh herons. So thank you, Dr. Fox, for joining us. I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Emily. Let me share my screen.
And while he's doing that, if you have questions during Dr. Fox's presentation, please put them in the Q&A, and I will answer the ones that I can and leave the rest for Dr. Fox to answer.
Okay, that's shared and you can see it. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming today to listen to me talk about some sturgeon. I really want to thank Emily for inviting me to do this. My name is Adam Fox. I'm an assistant professor at UGA at the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. And I've been working with sturgeon in Georgia for a while, and I'm excited to talk about that with y'all. Okay, so I'm going to start just by going through an outline here. I'm going to give you guys some species background about Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon. I'm going to talk about their status. I'm going to talk a little bit about UGA research with sturgeon, what we've been doing, and then kind of tie it up together with a summary of sturgeon in Georgia and how they're doing, and then switch to focus specifically on the St. Mary's River and talk about St. Mary's River sturgeons and some of the future research we hope to do in the St. Mary's. So sturgeon are among the most primitive of bony fishes. They've been around for a really long time. They're often referred to as living fossils because sturgeon that are alive today look pretty much exactly the same as their relatives did 100 million years ago. They have these long cylindrical bodies with a pointy snout. They have shark-like tails. And instead of scales like most fish have, they have rows of bony plates called scutes running down their body. They also have 4 barbels or whiskers under their snouts. And today there are 28 different species of sturgeon that are found across the northern hemisphere, and many of those species are imperiled. Historically, we had 4 different species of sturgeon that lived in Georgia, and today we have 3 different sturgeons. The Gulf sturgeon no longer lives in Georgia. Lake sturgeon live in the northwest corner of the state, and then Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon are what I'm going to talk about today. So this is the Atlantic sturgeon. The big fish in the back there is a full-grown adult, and then the little fish in the front is a 1-year-old juvenile. And then in between, we have a bunch of different sizes of subadults. So Atlantic sturgeon have been around as a species for about 85 million years. The adults, when they're fully grown, can measure anywhere between 5 and 14 feet long, although you don't see very many 14-footers around anymore. The largest one that I've personally seen has been about 8 feet long. They are a very long-lived fish. Their lifespan can be up to 60 years, maybe even more. And that's mostly in the northern portions of their range. In the south, they probably only live for more like 30 years. They are very slow to mature. Males can't reproduce until they're 6 to 8 years old, and females can take 10 to 12 years to mature. They're bottom feeders. They basically suction food out of the sand and the mud on the river and ocean bottom. And they typically feed on macroinvertebrates like crustaceans, worms, and mollusks, and they'll also eat small fish. Atlantic sturgeon inhabit the rivers and coastal oceans along the east coast of North America, and their range historically extended from the St. Lawrence River in Canada to the St. Johns River in Florida. Oh, sorry. This is my map. they may travel offshore as far as the edge of the continental shelf as well. They have a pretty unique anadromous life cycle, which means that they live in the ocean, but they spawn in fresh water. So I'm just going to go through their life cycle in a little bit more detail here. So the adults are marine, they live in saltwater, and they move all up and down the East Coast. So Atlantic sturgeon from Georgia will go all the way up to New York and maybe even beyond. And they mix with all of the sturgeon from all of the different rivers throughout the whole coast. But when it's time to spawn, they return to their natal river, their home river to spawn, back to where they were born, and they swim far upstream. And they'll mate and lay their eggs, and their eggs will hatch into larvae, and those larvae will slowly drift downstream. And then by the time the fish are about a year old, they are what we call river resident juveniles, and they inhabit the estuary of their natal river. Then at age 2 to 4, juveniles begin to leave their home river and they transition to the marine migratory life stage. And so these marine migratory juveniles will live in the coastal ocean. They'll mingle with the adults. They'll move up and down the coast. And occasionally they'll come back into their home estuary or other estuaries. And during this marine migratory life stage, they're just eating and growing until they reach maturity. And then they come back to their home rivers to spawn. And unlike salmon, which are also an anadromous fish, sturgeon will spawn many times over their long lives. So they don't die after spawning. They just return to the ocean and wait a year to 3 years or to 5 years, and then they come back and they spawn again. So short-nosed sturgeon are a little bit different. This is a short-nosed sturgeon, and they have been around for about 70 million years. It's a slightly younger species. They're much smaller than their Atlantic sturgeon cousins. Adults only grow to about 3 to 4.5 feet. That's as big as they get. They can live for at least 30 years, and they take 2 to 10 years to reach maturity. And like Atlantic sturgeon, they're also bottom feeders. Their diets consist mostly of macroinvertebrates. The short-nosed sturgeon's range historically extended from the St. John River in Canada to the St. John's River in Florida. And their life cycle is a little bit different. They're not anadromous, but they're amphidromous. And so what that means is their life cycle looks like this. Spawning still occurs far upriver, and eggs and juveniles drift downstream. Juveniles move into the estuary where they live in their nursery habitat. And then adults and subadults will also live in the estuary and the river. They don't leave to go to the ocean. The entire short-nosed sturgeon population generally stays within their home river, except that adults or subadults will occasionally make visits into the ocean or neighboring rivers to feed, but then they'll return to their home river. So these species look pretty similar, but there are some important differences that make them relatively easy to tell apart once you've seen pictures of them side by side. So we have an Atlantic sturgeon on the top here and a short-nosed sturgeon on the bottom. The easiest way to tell them apart is if it's bigger than 4.5 feet long, it's an Atlantic sturgeon. Short-nosed sturgeon just don't get that big. But you can also look at their snouts, and short-nosed do in fact have a shorter nose. That's not always easy to tell. Sometimes big Atlantic sturgeon look like they have pretty short noses, but it's one of the characteristics that helps set them apart. In Georgia, I've noticed that these two species tend to be different colors. So Atlantic sturgeon are sort of a blue-gray color, and short-nosed sturgeon are a coppery, almost reddish color. Short-nosed sturgeon are also noticeably slimy. If you ever got the chance to handle one, Atlantic sturgeon are not slimy. You can also tell them apart based on the ratio of their mouth width to snout width. So on the left here, if you look at the undersides of their head, Atlantic sturgeon have a much narrower mouth relative to their head than short-nosed. And finally, you can tell them apart by the placement of some of their scutes. So on the top is an Atlantic sturgeon, on the bottom is a short-nosed. And we're looking at the sturgeon's cloaca, or its butt, and the scutes immediately behind its cloaca. In Atlantic sturgeon, there's usually a pair of scutes, and in short-nosed sturgeon, there's usually one scoot. And so, there's a lot of variability in fish appearance, and not every fish is going to have all of the characteristics. But these are the ways that we look at when we see two sturgeons side by side to know which one is which species. So both of these species have some important differences, but they're similar in appearance. They have similar diets. They're both pretty long-lived and slow to mature. They both make long upriver migrations for spawning, and they both require nursery habitat for the juveniles in the estuary of their home river. We saw dramatic declines in the populations of both Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon during the 20th century, and that led to them being listed as endangered in the United States. So short-nosed sturgeon were charter members of the Endangered Species Act when it was passed in 1973, is when they were declared endangered. And then Atlantic sturgeon were listed as endangered in 2012, although harvest of them has been banned since 1998 in the US, and in Georgia, harvest has been banned since 1996. A big part of why these species are endangered relates to the fact that humans used to harvest them for their meat and caviar. And they've been harvested by humans since the native peoples in the pre-colonial times, but fishing pressure really increased on sturgeons in the late 1800s. And at the time, there was no distinction made between Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon. They were just considered sturgeon. And so this figure, which is really poor in quality, it shows the reported landings, so the harvest of Atlantic sturgeon in metric tons. And so in about 1900, there were about 3,000 metric tons of fish harvested along the Atlantic coast of the US. But by 1920, the populations were already crashing and harvest decreased dramatically to well under 100 metric tons. This figure shows harvest in Georgia from the 1960s to the 1990s. So the y-axis is landings, so captured harvested fish in kilograms. And so in Georgia, we saw this recent peak in harvest in about 1980, when 12,000 kilograms of sturgeon were harvested. And assuming an average Atlantic sturgeon weight of about 300 pounds, in 1981, that was about 88 fish that were harvested in the state of Georgia. And in blue, I've pulled out the harvest data for just the St. Mary's River. Harvest in the St. Mary's peaked in 1985 with a harvest of about 14 fish. And harvest kind of declined into the early 1990s. And then in 1996 is when Georgia banned the harvest of Atlantic sturgeon. So in addition to direct harvest, there are a number of other threats that sturgeon face. So the construction of dams in some of the rivers where they live blocked adults from accessing that upriver spawning habitat. Habitat loss has affected their spawning habitat and their nursery habitat. Like all aquatic animals, water pollution causes all sorts of issues for sturgeon. And even after sturgeon harvest was banned, sturgeon were and continue to be accidentally killed as bycatch in other fisheries. And as we now know, in busy ports, ship strikes are a major source of sturgeon mortality. The sturgeon are either in their nursery habitat or on their way up to spawning habitat or back to the ocean, and they're crossing paths with these huge ships that can cause mortalities. So researchers from UGA have been studying sturgeon in Georgia since the early 2000s, and we're looking at population dynamics, we're looking at ecology, and even though it sounds like we have a pretty good idea of what the sturgeon life cycle is, there's actually still a lot of holes, a lot of things that we don't know. And part of that is because much of what is known about Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon comes from rivers in the northern part of their range, especially the Hudson River and the Delaware River. And there are some important differences that we're discovering between fish up there in New York and fish down here in Georgia. So most of our research starts with first catching sturgeon so we can collect data. So we use anchored gill nets to capture fish. So this is a little illustration of a net in the water. And the hope is that we put this net out and sturgeon are going to swim around and they're going to get stuck in the net and we'll be able to access them. In reality, if any of you have ever gone fishing in a river down here, there's tons of other stuff in the river and we'll catch some of that as well. But once we've caught a fish, we are going to tag it, and we mark them with a pit tag, which is essentially the same thing as the microchip that's in your pet cat or dog. And every fish that we catch, we scan for a pit tag, and if it doesn't have one, we implant one in its body. And that way, if we catch it again, we'll be able to identify it. Each one has a unique number, just like in a pet. And using some mathematical modeling, we can estimate abundance from that proportion of recaptures to total captures of fish. So in the past, we've done this to estimate how many adult sturgeon there are, especially in the Altamaha River. And what we're doing right now is estimating the abundance of age 1 fish. So by counting the number of new fish that are entering the population each year, we can see trends in recruitment over time. So how many new fish are added this year and next year and the year after? And is that an upward trend? Is it a downward trend? Is it relatively consistent? It gives us an idea of what might be happening with the population in the future as those fish hopefully survive to become adults in a decade or so when they mature. And with the long-term data that we've been able to collect in some rivers, especially the Altamaha and Savannah rivers, we can start looking at what kinds of environmental conditions are happening in the river in years that produce lots of juveniles. So understanding what's driving the production of lots of new sturgeon in these rivers, what causes a good year, what causes a bad year, and it'll help us predict what will happen in the future with these populations. Another method we've used to estimate adult sturgeon abundance is using side scan sonar. And so this is a project we did in the Altamaha River. You can see on the map there, the Altamaha is in blue, and the area highlighted in red is where sturgeon spawn somewhere in that area in the Altamaha system. And we wanted to count the number of adults that were spawning each year. So we hooked up side scan sonar units to some small boats, and we slowly traveled through the entire spawning area. And side scan sonar, as you may know, essentially uses sound to create an image of the river bottom. So this is an example of side scan sonar from a shoaly area with some rocks on the bottom. You can see that rocky structure. And I'm sure many of you also know that side scan sonar is pretty good at helping find fish. And sturgeon are large fish, and they have those big bony plates in their bodies. And so they'll typically show up pretty well on sonar. These are some images of sturgeon that we captured on sonar. You can often actually see that heterocercal or shark-like tail. In the left, you can see the top of its tail. You can see their pointy snout. And so you can count fish. You can't count everybody. Not everybody gets detected by the sonar, but you can count them, and you can model mathematically to estimate the abundance of those fish in your study area. So we've done that in the Altamaha River. We found there's a couple hundred fish that spawn every year. We've also done several studies on sturgeon movement and migration patterns using acoustic telemetry. So basically, we implant a transmitter into the fish, and it sends out a little ping with a unique ID number. And so these tags, when we put them in juveniles, we have to use small tags because they're small fish, like in the picture here. They have a battery life of about 14 months, so we can track these fish for a little over a year in their nursery habitat. But the tags that we put in adult fish are much larger, and they can have a battery life of 8 to 10 years. So we can follow those fish out to sea, and when they come back, or if they go into other rivers, we can get detections for as long as a decade after we tag those fish. And we listen for pings with those fish using acoustic receivers. So they look like this. And we deploy them in the river. And so it's got a detection zone around it where it can hear those pings from the fish. And so when a sturgeon with an acoustic tag swims within range of the receiver, it's going to record the unique ID number for that fish and the date and time of detection. And as long as that fish is within range of the receiver, it will keep recording those detections of that fish. And so using those detection data, we can reconstruct sturgeon movements across our own array of acoustic receivers, but we also have partners all along the East Coast who share their detection data. So fish that I've tagged have been picked up in Delaware or even New York, and those scientists up there will send me their detection data, and it's really cool to see that. And the same, I'll share my detections of their fish from Georgia waters. We've done some research into sturgeon aging. So this is a cross section of a bone from a sturgeon's fin. And in fish, fin bones and ear bones actually have growth rings, just like a tree. So you can see the little inset here where I up the contrast. There are some lines, and those are growth rings, just like a tree growth ring. And you can count them to determine the fish's age. And understanding the age of the fish we catch is really helpful because it provides important information on the population structure. By knowing how many fish there are of a certain age, we can sort of look back in time and figure out how many there might have been when those fish were spawned, when they first hatched out. And finally, some new research that we're just getting into is some research with eDNA or environmental DNA. So here we have a river and the current is flowing downriver, so in this case, left to right. And any fish that's in the river is going to be shedding some of its skin cells or its slime coat into the river, and all that stuff contains DNA. So the fish is shedding DNA into the river. And if you collect water samples, you can actually identify the DNA strands that you're finding in the water and figure out what species they come from and confirm the presence of that species upstream of where you collected the water sample. So that's pretty useful for trying to determine if there are fish in a place where you can't catch fish, but you want to know if that species is present. So all this work over the past 20 years or so can kind of tell us about what's going on with sturgeon in the state of Georgia. So unfortunately, we don't really have any idea what these populations looked like before intensive human harvest began. There's a lot of historical references that talk about how a person could walk across the river on the backs of the sturgeon, talking about multiple East Coast rivers. And unfortunately, we do not have that many sturgeon in any river today. According to the species managers at the NOAA Fisheries Agency, few, if any, U.S. populations of short-nosed or Atlantic sturgeon are considered to have recovered from those population crashes caused by dam construction and overharvest and the other threats that I talked about. I want to briefly just go through the status of the different rivers in Georgia. This is a very qualitative sort of seat of my pants assessment based on a bunch of different kinds of data that we've collected. But the Altamaha River is pretty much the gold standard for sturgeon rivers in the South. It still probably has not recovered to pre-harvest levels. Nobody's walking across the river on the backs of those fish. But the Altamaha is a huge undammed river. It's pretty undeveloped through most of its basin. And it seems like it has the largest populations of both species of sturgeon south of the Delaware River. So I've marked its status here solidly in the green of our green to red, good to bad sturgeon meter. The Savannah River on the South Carolina border is also doing pretty well, which is kind of surprising because it does have a number of dams on it and a heavily industrialized port. But the Savannah River right now looks like it has the second largest populations of Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon in Georgia. Probably far fewer fish than there once were because of the dams and the development, but we do see consistent recruitment. New fish are being added to those populations every year. And there are relatively abundant fish. In the Ogeechee River between those two, the population of Atlantic and short-nosed are not doing so well. There are relatively few fish, and we don't see new recruits being added to the population every year. There's not successful reproduction every single year, which is something we would expect in a healthy population. And it's a similar story in the Satilla River. And there we actually see things are probably even worse for the short-nosed sturgeon population in the Satilla. St. Mary's we'll come back to in just a minute. And then the St. Johns River, which is the southernmost river that either species historically inhabited. Unfortunately, it seems like both Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeons are extinct in the St. Johns. There are no longer reproductive populations in those rivers, although Atlantic sturgeon, at least from other populations, may still sometimes visit the St. Johns estuary. So let's talk about the St. Mary's sturgeon, the whole reason that you guys are probably here today. So historically, both Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon occupied the St. Mary's River. But by the 1990s, those species were considered to be locally extinct or extirpated. There was a bunch of research in sort of 2008 to 2011 or so that continued to find no evidence of reproductive sturgeon populations in the river. But in 2014, I was working mostly in the Altamaha River that year, but some of my technicians were in the St. Mary's doing sampling, and they sent me this photo. So this is the first juvenile Atlantic sturgeon that was ever captured in the St. Mary's River. And based on its size, we know that it's an age 1 fish. And age 1 Atlantic sturgeon are too small to travel between rivers. They don't have a salt tolerance. So we were really excited because that meant this was a fish that was born in the St. Mary's River. And we found evidence of age 1 cohorts, age 1 fish, in 2014, 2019, and 2022. We've been looking every year. And sometimes we capture age 2 fish in the year after the years where we see age 1 fish. And we ended up having a big enough sample size of these small juveniles that the genetics scientists we were working with were able to determine these fish were from a genetically distinct population. So we confirmed that these really were St. Mary's Atlantic sturgeon, and the population was not extinct. They're just very few and far between. So that was pretty great. During the sampling, we also sporadically captured subadult Atlantic sturgeons. These are those marine migratory juveniles. This guy's probably 3 to 5 years old. He's pretty chunky fish. And so some of those subadults are St. Mary's, we know from their genetics, and some are visitors from other rivers. But sturgeon abundance in the St. Mary's appears quite low. We haven't gotten enough recaptures ever to estimate population size, but here's some data from that 2014, that first year where we saw those juveniles. So that year in the St. Mary's, we set nets, we sampled for 122 hours, and we caught 10 sturgeon. So that averages out to 0.08 fish per hour of our sampling. That same year in the Altamaha, we sampled for just 50 hours, we caught 76 sturgeon, and that was 1.5 sturgeon per hour of sampling. So they're there, but they're definitely not very abundant for the Atlantic sturgeon. For short-nosed sturgeon, it's a similar story. Oh, sorry, jumping ahead of myself. So we did put some acoustic tags in some of those fish to do some telemetry work, and we found that the juvenile fish in the St. Mary's stay largely in the estuary. In the winter, they actually move down more into Cumberland Sound, but they're kind of contained in the river, similar pattern to what we see in other rivers in Georgia. And then we saw a bunch of detections regularly of adults from other populations that were using Cumberland Sound and even the lower part of the St. Mary's River. So they're fish from Virginia, from Delaware, from the Carolinas. They were coming into Cumberland Sound regularly on a seasonal basis. We're guessing that it's probably to feed in the area. So for short-nosed sturgeon, since 2009, we've captured just 5 short-nosed in the St. Mary's River. And one was a small juvenile. That's the fish in the picture here that we caught in 2015. And based on its size, it's possible that this fish was born in the St. Mary's, but with a sample size of just 1, we aren't sure. There's no genetic baseline to match it to, so we can't match it to other fish to see if it's a St. Mary's fish. And with just 1 sample, that's not enough to differentiate it from the other nearby rivers. So Atlantic and maybe short-nosed sturgeon in the St. Mary's are going to face a number of pressures in the future, and I want to talk about those a little bit. So there are some natural threats to these fish. One of those that's pretty important is hurricanes. So hurricanes are a natural threat, but their frequency and intensity is likely to increase due to climate change. And hurricanes can cause serious problems for sturgeon populations. So at the beginning, when she introduced me, Emily mentioned that I study Gulf sturgeon in the Apalachicola River in Florida. And in 2018, Hurricane Michael made essentially a direct hit on that river. And the hurricane caused a prolonged hypoxic event in the Apalachicola River. So basically, there was no oxygen in the water in that river for about a month after the storm. And so fish that escaped right after the storm survived, but we estimated that 40 to 60% of adult Gulf sturgeon in that population died as a result of that hurricane. And so hurricanes can have pretty disastrous effects on these populations. And if a population is very small to begin with, then a hurricane killing a lot of those fish is a serious problem. The St. Mary's will also continue to face many of the anthropogenic threats that I mentioned earlier, including bycatch, potentially ship strikes, water pollution. There's also point source spills, so sort of general water pollution, but then things like oil or chemical spills that are more acute events. And then dredging and blasting can cause direct harm to fish as well. And really, habitat loss and habitat alteration are some of the biggest potential problems for sturgeon anywhere, especially in the St. Mary's River. So I'm going to talk mostly about Atlantic sturgeon here because we know that there are Atlantic sturgeon that are in the river. We know there's a population, but this also still largely applies to short-nosed sturgeon as well. So Atlantic sturgeon have that complex anadromous life cycle that I talked about at the beginning, and each life stage requires a different kind of habitat. So there's upriver spawning habitat, there's nursery habitat in the estuary, and there's foraging habitat in the estuary and offshore. And all of those habitats are equally important for that population, and the loss of any one kind of habitat or of connectivity between those different habitats can break the life cycle of the fish and put that whole population at risk. So habitat loss can occur through construction of dams, which can prevent sturgeon from reaching their spawning habitat. Dredging and channelization and other construction can damage spawning habitat or nursery habitat or feeding areas. And direct loss of those habitats is something that is occurring. This is a picture of the dredging in the Savannah River, which encroached into the nursery habitat for both sturgeon species there. Climate change is also going to alter the habitat for these fish. So the St. Mary's River is at the very southern edge of the habitat of the range for Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeons. And these species have physiological temperature tolerances. They can only handle so much heat, and above that they're just unable to survive. And they can't survive if the water gets too hot, and the water is continuing to get hotter, and it's already the southernmost hottest part of the water that they live in. Also, for juveniles, the warmer the water is, the less salt water or the less salt they can tolerate, and so they have to be further and further upstream away from the estuary as it gets hotter. Temperature also affects dissolved oxygen, and warmer water contains less oxygen, and all aquatic organisms need dissolved oxygen to be able to survive. So as the water is going to get warmer, it's going to put pressure on these fish in a number of different ways. And changes to the hydrology of the river also pose a threat to sturgeons. Climate change is going to be affecting hydrology as well through changes in precipitation patterns, but human action is also something that affects river hydrology. So if flows are too restricted, it may make the river too shallow, and adults may not be able to reach their upriver spawning sites. Or because flows have changed, those spawning sites may become unsuitable for spawning. It may not be enough current, or it may be too hot, or maybe there's too much current and juveniles and eggs get washed downstream too quickly. But it's something that can definitely be affected by hydrological changes. Changes to flow upstream will also affect water conditions in the nursery habitat. Reduced flows can allow saltwater to intrude further upstream, and young juvenile sturgeon have low salt tolerances, so they would have to move upriver to avoid that salt. And that might put them in areas where there's not enough for them to eat. And salinity is also probably going to affect the distributions of the sturgeon's food in the estuaries, both in the nursery habitat and in the lower estuaries that larger fish use for feeding. It may shift the patterns of when and where food items can be found and prevent those sturgeon from getting enough to eat. So there's still a lot that we don't know about sturgeon in the St. Mary's River and about sturgeon in the South in general. So in the St. Mary's, we're not sure if there is still a population of short-nosed sturgeon. If the fish that we've caught there were from a St. Mary's population, or if they were just visitors from other rivers. And if there are sturgeon there, we have no idea how abundant they might be. We're guessing if there are short-nosed sturgeon in the river, there's not very many of them because we haven't seen very many of them. We do know that there's that Atlantic sturgeon population, but we don't know how many adults remain, and we don't have a good idea of what's going to happen to this population in the future because there's so few adults and because they're facing all of these threats to them. We don't know where they're spawning in the St. Mary's. In fact, we don't know where they're spawning in most places. No one's ever seen an Atlantic or short-nosed sturgeon spawn in Georgia or in most of the rivers that they live in coast-wide. So most places we only have a general idea of where they spawn. They like a hard bottom substrate, depths of 2 to 9 meters, maybe deeper. And it seems like in the other rivers in Georgia, the places we think they're spawning are near shoals far upriver. And in the St. Mary's, there's not really very many shoals, and there's not really a whole lot of upriver. In the Altamaha, we see spawning over 200 kilometers upstream. That's the lower end of the spawning habitat. And in the St. Mary's, you hit the headwaters well before then. So we don't know where they are. But maybe some of you have seen adult sturgeon far upriver. I'm really interested to hear about that. I know Emily has been talking to some folks about that. Also about spawning, we don't know when they're spawning. So in some rivers, Atlantic sturgeon spawn in the spring. In others, they spawn in the fall. And in a few places, they spawn in both the spring and the fall. And so they could be spawning at, multiple times per year in the St. Mary's. We just don't know. So we know we have this small, fragile remnant population of Atlantic sturgeon in the St. Mary's. There don't appear to be very many of them, but they are periodically reproducing, which is great news. We don't know if we have a population of short-nosed sturgeon in the St. Mary's. And we really don't know what's in store for these fish in the future. But hopefully the continued research we're doing will help us answer some of these questions and learn more about these fragile small populations of sturgeon. So the research we've done in the St. Mary's and throughout Georgia has only been possible because of funding and partnership and collaboration with a lot of different groups, including the federal government, NOAA Fisheries, Georgia DNR, the U.S. Navy, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who have been doing a lot of the on-the-ground sampling in the St. Mary's River, NYU, that's where our geneticist works, and the University of Georgia as well. And I'd also like to thank Emily, the St. Mary's Riverkeeper, for the invitation to speak with you guys all today. And with that, I'd love to answer some questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Fox. We do have a question in the Q&A. It is from Malcolm Adams, who I know is frequently on the water, considering that I call him every time I need to get out on the water. And he says, if we do come into contact with a sturgeon in the St. Mary's River, alive or dead, is there a reporting mechanism you can let us know about on details, or is there a way we can put it on the St. Mary's Riverkeeper website that will link someplace else?
Yeah, that's a great and important question. So if you do see a live sturgeon, congratulations, that's awesome. If you catch one, which is really unlikely, the two species that we have in Georgia are very unlikely to be caught on hook and line. You need to let it go immediately. That's, they're endangered species, so just release it immediately, as quickly as you possibly can. And if you find a dead sturgeon, you can email me or call me, and I will attempt to get my team out to collect some data on that. So my email address is in this presentation, and Emily can share that around as well. But if you find a dead sturgeon, I'd love to know about it, because we scan it for pit tags to see if it's a fish that we know, and we take as many samples and measurements as we can from fish that are found that we salvage.
So can someone collect the dead sturgeon? Is that allowed?
Unfortunately, no. Okay. Because they're endangered, you're not allowed to possess even temporarily parts of sturgeon. So that's why it has to go through me and my team, who are on a permit that allows us to do that. But If it's floating in the river, you could potentially like drag it to the bank or something like that, and then send me a coordinate, and I can try and get a team out there to um, to find it and take some data.
Great. That was the only one in the Q&A, but I do have a few of my own while people are maybe typing in theirs quickly. If there were no sturgeon in the St. Mary's River during the 2008-2011 sampling period, why did y'all even consider going into the river?
So we suspected that if there were sturgeon in the St. Mary's, they were clearly not reproducing every year. But adults, Atlantic sturgeon and short-nosed sturgeon, they're periodic spawners. So males typically spawn every 1 to 3 years, and females spawn every 3 to 5 years. And so it may be a few years before the stars align and you end up with males and females in the same place in the river because they're on different reproductive schedules. And so checking every couple of years was sort of a way for us to check back in and see what had changed. We were also curious if maybe sturgeon from the Satilla or the Altamaha had strayed. Usually these fish always, like, there's no statistical number I'm aware of, but most fish return to their natal river to spawn. That's why we have genetically distinct populations in different rivers, but they do occasionally stray. And so if a fish from a different river had moved into the St. Mary's, saw it was unoccupied and spawned there, we might see our, reproduction with a different set of genetics from a different river in the St. Mary's. So we just kind of wanted to check back in and see what we saw. And then we were super excited to find age ones, and even more excited when the genetics indicated they were from the St. Mary's.
Do you think that, because the St. John's no longer appears to not have any spawning sturgeon anymore, there may be visitors in there. What is it? Do you think it's more from climate change that, because it seems like it's the St. John's that doesn't have any, the St. Mary's has few, the Satilla has few, the Altamaha has a strange number, the Ogeechee has none really. So I guess do you think climate change is really it, or do you think it's more of development along the spawning grounds that are kind of an issue?
So for the St. John's, the general consensus is that the only available potential spawning habitat in the St. John's was in a small tributary. I want to say maybe like the Ockalochnee, something like, I can't remember. It's been a little while since I brushed up on my Florida river pronunciations.
Ocklawaha.
Yeah. And so there was a dam that was built there in the 60s, and that likely cut off the access of any spawning habitat in the river from these fish. And so even if they're living 30 years, those fish were coming back trying to spawn, unable to spawn, and have all died. We did some extensive surveys in the St. John's to see if we found any juveniles, and we did not. Normally, if they're there, we find them within 50 hours or so of sampling, and we spent like 300 hours, and we didn't catch any. So anyway, that was probably the nail in the coffin for the St. John's population. But these fish are not really super well adapted to warm water. That's why the edge of Georgia and Florida is really the edge of their range. And so as the water is warming up, it's definitely impacting these southern systems first and sort of warming from the bottom up of the range. And so that's not very great for these Georgia populations at all.
Well, great. Based on the size of the St. Mary's versus, say, the Altamaha, which is much larger, is there a research method that's best for the smaller systems? So is it side sonar scanning that's best for smaller water systems, or the telemetry? You've done a little bit of telemetry in the river, but not side sonar scanning.
So the methods that I went through all work pretty well in all of these different sized rivers. If there are adult sturgeon in the St. Mary's, side scan is likely to be able to detect them if we are in the right place at the right time. The netting that we use for juveniles that also captures subadults and sometimes adults is pretty effective in any river, as long as we have some idea about where the fish are, which we pretty much do. We've got our nursery habitats pretty well established in all of the rivers in Georgia. So the reason we haven't done all of this stuff in the St. Mary's is more tied to lack of funding or of specific research projects that focus on the St. Mary's. Whereas there's been a lot of interest in the Altamaha as the best sturgeon population in the South.
I'm just going to keep going with my questions unless till somebody else asks one. With the St. Mary's River designated as critical habitat for sturgeon, which the NOAA fisheries says like 7/8 of the river, so pretty much most of it except the parts that's closest to the swamp, is considered critical habitat. What do you know what that means in regards to the protection of the river, or is that just like a title that a river carries?
It does afford some protection. So critical habitat is the specific area that's occupied by an endangered species. And for Atlantic sturgeon, it was designated in 2016. The species was listed in 2012. And the critical habitat covers all coastal waters and all sturgeon rivers, essentially up to the first dam or where it's too shallow for the sturgeon to access. Interestingly, critical habitat has never been designated for short-nosed sturgeon, even though they've been endangered since the 70s, but they would use those same habitats. And so what critical habitat does is any project that uses federal funds or requires a federal permit is required to avoid what they call destruction or adverse modification of critical habitat. So any project that uses federal funds, like a bridge reconstruction or needs a federal permit, they have to go through a consultation with the species managers at NOAA fisheries. And those managers will help determine if the plan for that construction needs to be modified to protect the sturgeon. So in practice, this happens a lot with bridge reconstruction. You know, a lot of our bridges in Georgia are aging out and they need to be repaired or replaced. And they'll find out that they're in critical habitat for Atlantic sturgeon, and they'll talk to the agency species managers, who will also often consult with me, and we'll figure out based on our data, you know, maybe there's a couple month time span when sturgeon aren't in that area, and that's the best time for blasting out the old bridge or driving in new pilings. So they can adjust their construction schedules to minimize the direct impacts on those fish. That only applies for things that need federal funding or federal permitting. So private landowners on private land, if they don't need federal input, do not need to do a critical habitat consultation. But nearly anything involving construction near the water should be covered by this critical habitat.
So a state permit does not have to do anything.
They don't,
for a state permit.
But yeah, so it's with the federal agencies, but most of the state stuff, even construction like Georgia DOT, they still have federal permits for working on bridges, and a lot of the transportation funding is from the federal government. So if the feds are involved basically in any way in the project, then it has to go through a consultation. And so like wetlands that are regulated by the Army Corps of Engineers also need to go through a consultation. And we try not to impose too many restrictions, you know, for bridges. As my example I keep going back to, there's usually some way that we can work it out to find a time where we can minimize the effects on the fish while still allowing that bridge construction to go on.
Well, there's a follow-up question to that. Is there a way to build breeding areas into the design of needed structures like bridges?
So that's a really interesting question. There are some places where spawning habitat has been supplemented in the river. So basically, the various states agencies have added gravel bars to areas in the hopes of encouraging more sturgeon spawning or spawning of other fish. And actually this happened with the robust red horse, which is a state endangered fish in Georgia. They added a lot of spawning habitat in areas where they thought that robust red horse might spawn. And it's really unclear on how effective that is. If it's in the right places, it might be great for them. There hasn't been a lot of sort of before and after assessments, certainly not with sturgeon. And then a lot of the habitat that was put out for robust red horse, you know, because there were no natural gravel bars in those areas, the sediment came in and buried them, which is why there were no natural gravel bars in those places. So it may not be a long-lasting solution.
I've heard rumors that historically they've dropped limestone in the St. Mary's to encourage spawning grounds for shad or striped bass, and so it may be possible for sturgeon as well. I don't know if that's
so we really don't know anything about where they're spawning or what the kind of habitat that they like to spawn in the St. Mary's, but hard bottom habitat is good for sturgeon spawning, and so if it's good for striped bass and if it's in the right part of the river, it may have benefited sturgeons as well.
All right, another question. Do blackwater rivers with lower bioproductivity capabilities, including low dissolved oxygen, naturally support a lower sturgeon population than a larger nutrient-rich system like the Altamaha or the Savannah?
We would expect, yes, that there were never as many sturgeon in the St. Mary's as there were in the Altamaha historically. But we really don't know how the relative sizes of those populations. We don't know if it was a lot smaller or a little bit smaller, but certainly that lower dissolved oxygen makes it a lot harder for the fish to live in the rivers. And there's really like less spawning habitat in a smaller river. There's less space. So there would end up being more competition for available food and space resources. So we would expect historically that there were a smaller population, but we still would expect that historical population probably had successful reproduction every year and, were visible in the river.
All right. And I have just one last question. So you spoke a little bit about the future of the species of the St. Mary's River. Would you consider this population to have a healthy genetic diversity? And would there be a possibility of introducing other sturgeon into the river to help with the population growth? It wouldn't be a St. Mary's specific species, but at least it would grow.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Right now, it really kind of seems like the Atlantic sturgeon are probably barely hanging on in the St. Mary's, just given the low abundance of juveniles and low frequency of reproduction. But an adult sturgeon in the South, an Atlantic sturgeon or a short-nosed sturgeon can live 30 years. And so it may have, 20 years or more of potential reproduction. And an adult female Atlantic sturgeon can produce somewhere between 400,000 to 2 million eggs. So, if the conditions are actually right for juveniles and a few fish are able to meet up and reproduce, you could potentially have incredible recruitment from that event. That's, most of those eggs don't end up getting fertilized, and the fertilized ones don't end up surviving to adults, but there is a lot of potential there that they could. According to the genetics analysis from our 2014 juveniles that we caught, the St. Mary's does seem like it has lower genetic diversity than the other rivers nearby. I'm not a geneticist, but our geneticist has told me that there's fewer alleles and less diverse alleles than some of the other populations in the South. And in general, the Southern populations are closer to each other in genetics than more Northern populations that are more genetically distinct from each other. Those age 1 juveniles we caught in 2014, they were mostly full or half siblings with each other. So they had at least one of the same parents shared, but there were a few that were unrelated to the others. So, that likely means at least 4 fish managed to successfully spawn that year. We really don't know what that low genetic diversity might do for the future of this population. In the past, supplementing the population with fish from a hatchery was extensively proposed and I guess discussed. This is a little bit before my time as a sturgeon scientist in Georgia. And supplementing populations was done in several other rivers, but NOAA Fisheries, the federal agency that manages the species, has decided that that's not a good idea because of the genetic differences between those rivers. If you're putting fish in a river that are not the same genetic strain as the natives, then you're going to alter the native genetic population genetics forever, and you'll never get that back. So introducing non-local fish has not been considered a viable opportunity for a while. That might be different if the population actually was extirpated, but the habitat was still good. But that's a decision that comes down from the federal level. However, there was at one point also talk of streamside rearing. So that's where you catch some spawning fish in the river, you squeeze the eggs and milt out of them and fertilize those eggs and hatch them in a mobile facility right on the riverbank that's sucking in water from the river and flowing it across all these. So they're imprinting on the river. The breeders are from that population. And that's a really interesting potential way to supplement the population. You might increase survival. So if you can get a female and a male, maybe, you know, instead of 10% of her eggs actually surviving to the juvenile stage, maybe you could get 20% survival by helping them and protecting them in a hatchery. But as far as I'm aware, streamside rearing hasn't actually been done for Atlantic sturgeon anywhere for short nose either. And in that situation, you wouldn't have to worry about the genetics, but you are limited by the number of adults you catch. And in this case, we've never caught any adults in the St. Mary's River. But that's certainly another possible alternative to supplementing populations.
All right. Well, I want to be respectful of some people's time. We're about 4 minutes after. I did want to share some cool pictures that I recently received. These are from Sturgeon catch in the St. Mary's River back in the 50s. And they are huge. I mean, this eyeball right here just scares me. But there are huge sturgeon that apparently have been caught in the St. Mary's River almost the entire length of the truck bed. So it was pretty cool to be able to see that historically.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to share those. And then finally, to close us out, just some action items of what y'all can do today. Engage with St. Mary's Riverkeeper in one of our educational events such as this. We're hoping to have another lunch and learn in a couple of months, maybe try to do these quarterly. We also have our previous 4 lunch and learns on our website under advocacy webinars. Urge your elected officials to protect the St. Mary's River by passing legislation that protects our waterways. And then today is actually the last day that you can comment to the National Park Service to nominate the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge to be listed as a World Heritage Site, to be considered to be a World Heritage Site. So please go ahead and do that, and you can learn more about those requirements, the comment process, and some suggestions we have put together for your comment letter. So please do that. I do encourage, if you can't do it today, please just do it anyways at a future date, because if the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge becomes a World Heritage Site, the St. Mary's River will be bookended by a world treasure and a national treasure. So that's pretty cool to be able to say about your St. Mary's River. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Dr. Fox. If y'all have any follow-up questions, please let me know. I'm happy to share Dr. Fox's information with you as long as he's okay with that. And then this website will be, or this recording will be put up on our website once I'm able to do that. So thanks everybody. And thank you, Dr. Fox. Y'all have a great rest of your day.